I survived the Boston Marathon bombing. A story of one teen's resilience and the bond between mother and daughter. By Kristen Lewis, with Sarah Jane Bryan. A feeling of excitement filled the crisp spring air as Sydney Corcoran, 17, and her parents stood at the finish line. It was April 15, 2013, and they were among the more than 500,000 spectators who had turned out for the annual Boston Marathon. This beloved tradition has been held since 1897, making it one of America's oldest and most famous races. It's an inspiring event in which runners of all backgrounds push themselves to the limits on a grueling 26-mile course through the streets of the city. Sydney felt electrified as she scanned the sweaty faces passing by, trying to spot her Aunt Carmen. Already, 2/3 of the 23,000 runners had crossed the finish line on Boylston Street, each exhausted athlete having been cheered on by the throngs of people on the sidewalks and in the stands. But Sydney never did spot her aunt, because suddenly there was a deafening blast. She stumbled backward, shocked. A second blast followed moments later. 2 bombs had just been set off, shattering store windows. The air filled with smoke and the sounds of screaming. Dazed runners stopped in their tracks, trying to understand what was happening. A few began running back the way they had come. At first, Sydney did not realize how seriously she was injured. She felt pain, but when she looked down, the smoke was too thick to see the gaping hole in her foot or the metal pieces, one as big as a cell phone, lodged in her legs. She was losing blood and soon fell to the ground, unconscious. What should have been a day of celebration and triumph had turned into a nightmare. Madness and horror. Security measures had been tight that day, with bomb-sniffing dogs and more than 1,000 police officers and soldiers patrolling the race. Even so, 2 young men had managed to slip through the crowd carrying homemade bombs in their bulky backpacks. Camera footage would later show each man dropping his bag and walking away. These bombs had been designed for one purpose: to maim as many people as possible. Each bomb was filled with shrapnel, nails, ball bearings, chunks of metal. As the bombs detonated, this shrapnel hurtled through the crowd, ripping through flesh. All around Sydney, scenes of agony were playing out. The wounded were everywhere. Body parts littered the streets. Purses, phones, signs, and other belongings dotted the sidewalks like confetti, dropped by panicked spectators as they fled. The area would later be compared to a war zone. Yet amid the madness and the horror, many rushed to help one another. Some pulled people away from the smoke. Others raced toward the injured, kneeling beside bleeding victims. They cinched nearly severed limbs with belts, slowing the flow of blood. When Sydney regained consciousness, she found herself surrounded by strangers. A man was pressing on her leg, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Another man was holding her hand. He was telling me, "You're going to be okay. Just look at me, squeeze my hand so I know you're okay," Sydney remembers. My whole body was going numb and tingly. Then someone yelled, "She has to go to the hospital, now." I knew I was dying. Police scrambled to secure the area, trying to make sense of what had happened and at the same time get people to safety. No one knew whether more bombs might be hidden nearby. Emergency responders worked frantically to ferry the injured to nearby hospitals. As Sydney was loaded into an ambulance, a wave of tiredness washed over her. "I knew that I was dying," she remembers. "I just wanted to sleep. I knew what that meant, and I was trying to come to terms with that." She would later learn that a piece of metal had ruptured her femoral artery. One of the body's most important arteries, it carries blood to the lower half of the body. When this artery is cut, a person can bleed to death in minutes. As Sydney fought for her life, Americans across the country were glued to the news. Many recalled the devastating attacks on September 11, 2001, when terrorists flew planes into the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. In the emergency room, a nurse spoke soothingly, reassuring Sydney that she was safe now. Then it hit her. Where were her parents? Were they hurt? Were they alive? I thought, all I have is my brother. I thought I was an orphan, Sydney says. But she would have to wait to get answers. Doctors rushed Sydney into surgery for a complex operation that would take more than 6 hours. Where's Mom? When Sydney awoke, a familiar face appeared beside her bed. With tears in his eyes, her father took her hand and smiled. To Sydney's relief, he and her Aunt Carmen were unhurt. Sydney couldn't speak because of a tube down her throat that was helping her breathe, so her dad brought her a pen and paper. Where's Mom? She scribbled. That's when Sydney learned the news. Her dad gently explained that her mother was alive. She was even in the same hospital, but her legs had been badly mangled. The doctors had had no choice but to amputate them. Sydney demanded to see her mother, though nurses worried that the reunion would be too emotional for Sydney in her fragile condition. When her mom was wheeled into the hospital room, we immediately grabbed hands and looked at each other, says Sydney. We started crying, thinking, we can't believe what happened to us, but we're both here and we're okay. A terrorist plot. Meanwhile, an army of law enforcement officials had begun locking down a 15-block area that had just become the largest crime scene in Boston's history. Police, FBI agents, bomb experts, forensic scientists, all sprang into action. They faced unprecedented challenges. In the coming hours and days, they would examine thousands of hours of video footage from surveillance cameras and cell phones, interview hundreds of witnesses, and sift through the debris for anything that might help them figure out what had happened and who was responsible. They even collected shrapnel that surgeons removed from victims. By the next day, investigators had found camera footage of the two young men. Soon, they would be identified as Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, 19, and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, 26. The brothers had come to the U.S. more than a decade earlier from Kyrgyzstan, near Russia, as refugees. Dzhokhar was an American citizen. Why did young men who grew up and studied here, as part of our communities and our country, resort to such violence? President Obama asked in a national address. Many Americans wondered the same thing. From what officials were able to piece together later, the brothers had begun to follow an extreme form of Islam that most Muslims do not agree with. The brothers had come to view anyone outside of their religion as an enemy. Boston shut down as a massive manhunt was launched. The streets eerily quiet as if the entire city was holding its breath. At last, on April 19th, the brothers were located outside Boston. Tamerlan was killed in a shootout with police. Dzhokhar escaped but was found later that night. As the news swept through the city, hundreds took to the streets to celebrate. But it was bittersweet. By then, the injury toll from the bombing had been tallied at more than 250. Many of the injured had lost limbs, like Mrs. Corcoran. 3 people had died. Each other's team. As the drama unfolded outside the hospital, Sydney and her mom remained focused on one thing: getting better. They shared a hospital room for several weeks before being moved to a rehabilitation facility, where physical therapists helped them recover their strength and mobility. It was a difficult time. The hole in Sydney's foot was healing, but it would take time for the bone, tendons, and muscles to fully knit back together. Sydney's muscles had also atrophied, so she used a walker until she gained enough strength for crutches. She remembers the sense of accomplishment she felt the first time she was able to walk across her room. Sydney's mom, meanwhile, was trying to adjust to life in a wheelchair and to what life without her legs would mean. Through those painful weeks and months, mother and daughter drew strength from each other. We were each other's team, Sydney says. My mom had this sense of humor. I looked up to her because she was coping so well. I saw her strength and perseverance. That encouraged me to keep going. Looking ahead. It's been more than a year since the bombings. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's trial is scheduled to begin this fall. If convicted, he may get the death penalty. In Boston, things have returned to normal, more or less, though there are still reminders of that day, memorials honoring victims, increased security, locals wearing Boston Strong t-shirts. Sydney's family has found a sense of normalcy too. Her mom was fitted for prosthetic legs, which enable her to walk, run, and swim. Though Sydney was never well enough to return to school, she was able to walk the stage at graduation and accept her diploma. She was even voted prom queen. Sydney has had 6 operations and will likely need more. And she still has flashbacks, moments when the sounds, sights, and smells of that day come rushing back with crippling intensity. For survivors of traumatic ordeals, the emotional injuries can be just as devastating as the physical ones, and sometimes they take much longer to heal. Sydney's flashbacks are a symptom of a debilitating condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is common for war veterans as well as for victims and witnesses of violence. PTSD sufferers can have nightmares, depression, and trouble concentrating and sleeping. But Sydney is determined to move forward. She copes with her feelings by writing about them and by seeing a therapist. The strangers who saved her life are now her close friends. She turns to them when she needs to talk. This past fall, Sydney started college. She finds joy in taking life one day at a time. Ever since the bombing, I just want everybody to be happy and to be okay, she says. We should be supportive of each other no matter what, because you never know what somebody is going through.